through consciousness there is a thought flow which creates the impression of a mind experiencing time. This is getting so abstract now I'm going to faint if I go down this road any longer.
If the mind, if this is non-duality, surely in duality there is the mind and then there's the part that isn't connected. The part that is always freshly arising.
Where's this duality?
Well, in there's the mind, one part of the
There's the
duality,
appearance.
and then there's the constantly arising second part of duality.
I'm going to retreat back again into the metaphor of the nighttime dream.
Yes.
There is the appearance of the mind. There is the appearance of time. There is the appearance of a trajectory through time. All of these things not only can, but do happen in nighttime dreams, and all of them are blown apart in 1 second of awakening, which happens when the alarm goes off. It's only a metaphor, but it's probably the best metaphor there is. I mean, the mind will never understand this, but that might be about as close as it can get. So you, I, everywhere else, everyone else in here has experienced, has had the experience of a time flow which we know doesn't exist. Without boringly narrating the numerous happenings that might have occurred in one of my dreams last night. Those happenings could only unfold in time. You know, a happening, then another one, and then another one, and then another one, all requiring time. And all of it seemed not to exist at the moment of waking up. Well, often actually, not at the moment of waking up, but a few seconds later. Because often, at the moment of waking up in the morning, the person hasn't reassembled itself. It needs the person in a way, it needs the kind of the recognition of who I am to reassemble itself, to notice that the nighttime dream happened and that it was an appearance. And very often, in the first waking up in the morning, the person doesn't reassemble itself. That's why there's kind of sometimes kind of blessed space immediately, followed by a bit of agonised confusion as I put myself back together and remember that I've got a dental appointment that day and notice that the cat's been sick on the duvet.
There is a person, Byron Katie.
Yes,
and she woke up and lost her identity when she doesn't notice a cockroach walking over her leg. And when she left this halfway hut where she was staying, she had to be shown how to drive her car home. And she had courage to actually drive. She had completely relearned everything.
Yeah, the stories of the way. Yeah.
That is exactly what she didn't reconstruct.
It's like that. It's like that split between a split second and a few seconds, talking in terms of time after we wake up from our nighttime sleep, where there is that kind of blank. It's like that exaggerated or absolutely. Yeah, and there are kind of. There are sort of extraordinary stories of awakening, let's say, out there. One of the best known is Susan Seagal's. They tend to be unusual, though. Sometimes people get concerned about them because they are extraordinary and in some cases traumatic, but they tend to be quite unusual. Yeah. I think more often what happens is that when there's a waking up, this simply goes on functioning automatically, which is what it's always been doing, you see. There's no particular, I don't know what's happening in Byron Katie's case, but there's no particular reason why, let's say, on awakening, on the shedding of the person, this shouldn't be able to perfectly well drive its car. Not only drive its car, but drive its car home rather than to some random location. Which is, you know, there's no reason why that kind of anarchy should take over this system when the sense that there's a person in here doing the driving and finding the way home has disappeared, because this was always doing it without a person being there. This was always just functioning.
It's a great relief.
I mean, actually, driving a car is a very good, again, just a metaphor, but a very good metaphor in a way, isn't it? Because, you know, we know that driving a car is one of those things that the autonomic nervous system, you know, can take over. You know, I'm sure, you know, any of us who drive habitually will have had the experience of driving maybe mile after endless miles with absolutely no conscious control whatsoever. Hello.
Hey.
Late again, I see. Feel better late than never. And just in time for tea and biscuits as well.
Perfectly timed.
Perfectly timed. Yeah, I mean, driving is actually a good metaphor, isn't it? Because that is one of those habitual actions that, you know, if you like, the unconscious system is perfectly capable of taking over. It usually does. Most of the time when we're driving, we're not consciously feeling that we're in control. So before liberation, chop wood and drive car. After liberation, chop wood and drive car. Before liberation, someone chops wood. After liberation, no one drives car. But having said that, you know, with respect to Byron Katie and Susan Siegel and so forth, sometimes awakening is so sudden and is attended with some very uncomfortable feelings, and it is difficult for that person then to go on, if you like, functioning in the world in an ordinary way. But those are rare. To weave a story, we're desperate to weave a story, and we're very desperate to weave a story around this sort of stuff, whether we call this sort of stuff non-duality, or Advaita, or Buddhism, or enlightenment, or following the Guru, or the path of devotion, or Raja Yoga. It doesn't matter. You know, we are desperate to weave a story around this, and it's pretty obvious. We need to spend half an hour on the internet tonight on YouTube. It is amazing the stories that we will discover on there around this. Stories involving the necessity of growing very long beards and wearing enormous hats and satin robes, or being celibate except when no one is looking. We love these stories, depending, if you like, depending on that character and that personality. And some of them can provide us with very entertaining experiences if we have the right kind of character to enjoy them. You know, the path of devotion. Well, going back to what I was mentioning earlier, Louis Theroux's documentary, you know, the path of Hare Krishna. I mean, what a delightful way to spend the day. Dancing and chanting and eating nice vegetarian food with a lot of other very amenable people. Absolutely delightful. Completely meaningless. No more meaningless than anything else. completely meaningless because, like everything else, it doesn't need a meaning. It's sufficient in itself. Dancing the Hare Krishna dance and chanting the Hare Krishna chant is without meaning, and it doesn't need meaning. Neither does drinking vodka and rum. It's what's happening. This is an incautious word to use. It comes from my kind of spiritual background, I suppose. It's what's unfolding. The problem with that phrase, what's unfolding, is it implies something going somewhere. Nothing's going anywhere. Everything is simply what it is. It doesn't need to be going anywhere. And that's its glory in a way. Isn't it kind of obvious in a way that is the glory of everything? That it doesn't need to be going anywhere or unfolding in any way or to have any meaning other than itself. Isn't that kind of...
Sometimes I think that maybe in order to build houses and stuff, the other outcome of that is to concoct these stories. I mean, I don't know.
They happen.
No, I know, but somewhere along the line, animals don't concoct stories.
No.
But then they don't build aeroplanes.
No.
So maybe because we have this frontal cortex or whatever, that we build aeroplanes, we have to also take the other rubbish.
Well, that's what happens. That's clearly what happens. Obviously what happens is we both build aeroplanes and concoct stories. But what I'm saying is, isn't it the glory of stuff, really, to see that it doesn't need meaning? Which is the same as saying it doesn't need to be anything other than what it already is. The vase of flowers, this imaginary vase of flowers here, I'm being told that tea is ready, but this imaginary vase of flowers here, the vase of flowers, it doesn't become any more wonderful because it has been chanted over and dedicated to the glory of the Guru and then presented to the Guru. However, if that happens, if the chanting happens and the dedication happens and the presenting to the Guru happens and that's enjoyed, that's also fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But none of it has any meaning. It's all simply what's happening. Oh, we do have a lot. They're a little bit past their set, aren't they? Never mind. The flower doesn't need a meaning to be a perfectly wonderful flower. Rosie, it never occurs to Rosie, what's my meaning in life? Why am I here? What's my purpose? Should I be spending more time devoted to the Guru or serving God? Rosie just gets on with being Rosie. It's the same for us. We don't need a meaning to justify ourselves. The rose doesn't need a meaning to justify itself. The Rosie doesn't need a meaning to justify herself. Everything is simply what it is. And that's its glory. So it makes just as much sense to say that nothing has any meaning as to say everything is its own meaning. Depending on our cast of mind and our character, we might prefer one way of putting it to the other. It doesn't matter, it's the same thing. And the trouble with, we really are going to stop putting this, but the trouble with all these stories that we tell about, which are always obviously about the future and the past, they have to involve the past and the future, all these stories that we tell, they leach the wonder out of this. It's like scrubbing this with bleach. You know, if I have a story up here about devoting myself to the service of God and and I've got to convert, I've got to spend my time converting so many whatevers and endless. It leeches the glory out of this. It's kind of obvious in a way that to whatever extent attention is on the past and the future, which is what stories are about, it cannot be on this. Now we're getting dangerously close here, I can feel, to the possibility of a practice emerging, where we end up suggesting that we all try jolly hard to notice this and to block out the past and the future. We don't want to go down that path. I certainly don't want to go down that path, so we really will have to see biscuits now before we develop a full-blown non-duality practice. The mind is the process of thinking or perceiving, we could say. I mean, you can take the choice, if you like, but it's the process. Let's say, to keep it really simple, because most people immediately associate mind with thought. So the easiest thing to say is the mind is the process of thinking. There is a process for thinking. A thought comes up, a thought comes up, it dies away again. Another thought comes up, it dies away again. So the mind, what we think of the mind, is simply the process of that. And it's an example of what psychologists call reification, where, if you like, we take a concept really, or a process, and we think about it or talk about it as if it's a thing, as if it really exists inside. I mean, you could say that the subconscious is an example of reification, which almost everybody knows. When we talk about the subconscious, it's quite useful to talk about the subconscious. It helps in a way to explain all sorts of phenomena and to understand all sorts of aspects of ourselves. But we then start thinking that it's actually an object somehow, an actual sort of, if you like, a split off part of itself. The mind's very similar, except of course the mind is felt to be more central. So, actually what it is a process of thinking, a process of thought, or if we want to be a little bit more complex, we could say it's the whole process of perception. So all perception belongs to this non-existent thing that we call the mind. So the mind is also the process of being, it's the process of perceiving. By the time we've expanded it out to that, it's become virtually indistinguishable from consciousness itself. And consciousness is a very slippery word indeed. The point in a way, I just add this one thing, the point in a way is that for most of us living in separation, not absolutely everybody, certainly not for everybody who consumes huge quantities of ganja, but for most of us living in separation, the mind is very active. In other words, to rephrase that, what that means is that the thought process comes very fast. And it seems to be very solid. So there's a thought and another thought and another thought. And these thoughts often are very gripping. They often have a great deal of emotional glue around them as well. So they feel very sticky as well. And because thought comes so thick and fast, and we can't notice, if you like, the background against which these thoughts appear, that does tend to create this impression that there is something solid in here which is thinking. There must be something, some part of me which is giving rise to these thoughts because they seem so solid, and so that part is taken to be the mind. And in a way, we could say, you know, talking about the mind or talking about the person or talking about the self with a small s, it's all the same thing in a way. Just that impression that there is this solid thing in here which is me and which gives rise to that which seems so absolutely personal to me, my thoughts. And the paradox, of course, as I said before, is that no matter how much we feel the solidity of this thing called my mind, when we look for it, we can never find it. The reason we can never find it is because it doesn't exist. If the mind flow, if the thought flow, if you like, relaxes for whatever reason at all, meditation or ganja or knows what else. When the mind flow, thought flow begins to relax, it becomes a little bit less gripping, this idea that there is a mind. It begins to be noticed that actually thoughts do just arise and fall away. That's not a recommendation to do anything. It's not a recommendation either to do Buddhist meditation or to go and see your devotee. It's also not a recommendation not to do either of those things.
The thoughts aren't local to this particular body.
You say they're not, or they are?
What I'm hearing you say is they're not local. They could be anywhere in this room, they could be in China, but they arise.
Well, they seem local.
Yes.
They seem to be local.
Yes.
So the thoughts that arise seem to arise here rather than arising in that chair. They seem to be local. There are events, let's say, where it seemed quite directly that that's not the case. It seemed quite directly that my awareness, which is localised here, is firstly not mine, and secondly, it's not localised here. So there are events where that can be seen directly. But they're not particularly important.
If they're not important, why does our body react? Why do we have reactions that are particular to the thoughts that we're having?
No, I'm not saying the thoughts aren't important. I'm
But
saying
even if the mind doesn't exist, sorry.
I'm saying an event where it's seen directly that thoughts aren't localised or awareness isn't localised. I mean, it's an event. It has. It's without meaning in the same way that everything else is without meaning, or it's its own meaning, if you like. Is that what? Have I misunderstood your question?
If that's the case, then biologically, why are we formed in a way that we react to these events that happen? So there are natural reactions to these events that we can't, if you like, control. So if I've had a thought and it's gripping and it's stuck and it's sticky and all that, and for that reason I cry or I get goose pimples or I have a reaction that is outside of my own control, how do you explain the fact that it's actually separate, the separation element of that? How do I stop that happening? And how do I explain it?
How do you stop what happening?
There's a reaction that comes with the idea that you have a mind that creates the thought. And then
Want to stop that happening, that reaction?
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes, yeah. You started off by saying, why does that happen, I think. And the kind of the root answer to that, if you like, the answer which is most relevant to what we're talking about here, is because that's what happens. That's what arises out of nothing and falls back into nothing. Thoughts arise and fall back. A reaction arises and falls back. The thought or the feeling that these both belong to me arises and falls away again. If we wanted to become a bit more sophisticated and tell a bit more of a story about, why certain reactions happen and why, for example, we could tell all sorts of stories about that, some of which perhaps the simplest would be a Darwinian imperative, evolutionary survival. There's probably a very good reason why when something happens which is either actually threatening to you or you take to be threatening to you by mistake, there's probably a very good survival reason why you then feel fear. Now, I might at this point have entirely missed the point of your question, so take over again. Are we going roughly in the right direction?
Yeah, we are, definitely.
Yeah. So in terms of why, we can take, well, let's not take either of two routes. Let's just give those two answers. In a way, as far as we're concerned, what we're talking about here is this is simply what happens. This is simply how, if you like, the appearance of reality configures itself. At this particular moment, a feeling of fear arises. Maybe just before that, a bus was bearing down us, or maybe not, because there are free-floating feelings as well. Feelings aren't always triggered by events, of course. So on the purest level, we can say, well, that's simply what's happening. And then if we want to become a bit more sophisticated about it, well, in that case, we could spend far more than all the time we've got left this afternoon and all of tomorrow talking about it, but that would be one starting point. One starting point would be, well, there is a certain Darwinian imperative as to why we feel fear in certain situations. There may well be as to why we feel sadness. You mentioned feeling sad, yeah? I don't know, I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but I think we could probably talk about empathy, right? And the survival value of empathy. And how does empathy work? It works through feeling. Might that feeling be connected to sadness? If something, for example, is threatening a child of ours or something like that. So to a certain extent we could see a lot of simply natural kind of evolutionary development behind all sorts of feelings. The same with anger, conflict, the need to protect ourselves. Let's stick with children, because that's quite a sort of feeling. So anger when our children perceive a threat to our children. Evolutionary imperative. You might hypothesise, I don't want to go too far down this path, but you might hypothesise that if there ever were humans that didn't have an anger reaction to threat, or a sadness reaction to a situation where other humans felt empathy, or a fear reaction to threat, those humans probably didn't get to breathe very much, and they probably all died out. Which is why the only humans you've got left apart from the psychopaths are the ones that respond to threat or loss or things like that with anger or sadness or fear. So to some extent we could just talk on that level. To another extent, and I will stop on this in a few minutes because we are getting very psychological here, and I try not to do that too much. You could say a great deal of the feeling sensations that arise in neurotic. That's another possibility that we all know about. When we feel fear, it's not necessarily because there's a saber-toothed tiger bearing down on us, or a big red bus. A lot of the time, if we feel fear, it's because there's a neurotic pattern running us. When we wake up why is it always 4:30 in the morning that we wake up in a state of panic and anxiety? Or is that just me? Why is that more likely to happen at 4:30 in the morning than at 9 o'clock in the morning? That can happen then as well. Because we have neurotic patterns flowing. So there you go, we've got sort of two answers there. We can recognise that some of our feelings are just a natural response, which we can use the word evolutionary about if we want to, and some of our feelings are a neurotic response. In other words, we feel anxious or fearful about things at times when we actually can't do anything about them, which is a bloody stupid thing to feel, but nevertheless most of us do feel that. So in that case we might like to take ourselves off to a psychotherapist, or smoke more ganja, or engage in more positive thinking, or whatever. Is that kind of touching on it? We notice that, again, I really will shut up about it after this, but we were talking about this a little bit in the tea break. We were talking about the shadow, and denial of the shadow. Often feelings force their way through, they erupt volcanically through our best efforts to deny them because we're denying the shadow. So that's another reason why we might be overtaken by completely irrational feelings that have no survival value whatsoever. Because we might have had a long pattern of pushing away the shadow, particularly if we've been walking spiritual paths. It's one of the problems with the spiritual parts. They can be very attractive in many ways, and not all of them encourage this by any means, but some of them very much encourage us to deny the shadow. So it's hardly a surprise then if after 5 years of denying the shadow, it suddenly all erupts in an uncontrollable way. And we have a complete meltdown in a totally inappropriate situation. So that would be another. That would be another part of it. So that's quite enough. Unless you want to ask, if there's anybody who wants to ask about this, that's quite enough. Feelings.
Could I ask about decisions and choices? Because I had the impression that because there's no one here, or well, don't really like me yet, but
no, there is no one there. There may be a feeling that there is someone there,
yes.
But there is no one there, I promise you.
Great. So going with what I've heard you say and Tony say, there is no one here to make choices and decisions. But then in your writing I saw you say that if you have a toothache,
Am I going to be hoisted by my own guitar?
you explain what is it that takes you off to the dentist? Or want to have an income so your living standard is more comfortable than sleeping in the gutter?
Well, this psychophysical organism seems to like comfort. It's a rather lazy psychophysical organism, and it quite likes being comfortable. So if it has a toothache, it takes itself to the dentist because it finds that way life is more comfortable.
So it's the physical organism that phones the dentist? It's the physical organism that phones the dentist?
If you like, yes, phoning the dentist. Toothache happens, then phoning the dentist happens, then terror happens.
Yes.
As the injection, I actually have a very good dentist. Then relief of toothache happens. I gave a talk years ago, and somebody said that if this was seen, it would be terrible for me because I wouldn't get up and go to work anymore, and my mortgage wouldn't be paid. And I just, do you like living in a house? Do you want to live in a ditch? No, well, in that case, probably, if this is seen, that will still get up and go to work because that wants to live in a house and not in a ditch. That wants to be comfortable. By the way, where that decides that it doesn't care whether it lives in a house or a ditch, and it doesn't care whether it's comfortable or not, it's often because it is bought into some hideously destructive spiritual story. Oh, the universe will provide, the grace of the guru will look after me, so I don't need to go to my sodding job anymore. But it's not what a surprise if that happens and then a month later I'm homeless and living in a ditch. We weave these wonderful stories. But does this kind of directly, you started off by talking about choice and decision, so have you addressed that?
Yeah, well for me, that's great to kind of have the idea that it's that does it.
Don't forget, I haven't said that there are no choices and no